Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the session, Certain Uncertainty, Next Generation Water Planning for Deep Uncertainty. My name is Anil Mishra from UNESCO's Intergovernmental Hydrological Program. On behalf of the organizing team, Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, International Center for Integrated Water Source Management, Deltaris, and UNESCO ISP, I would like to welcome you to this session, which is very relevant in the context of recent release of IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, The Physical Science Basis, which highlighted continued global warming is projected to further intensify global water cycle, including its variability and severity of wet and dry events. We have recently witnessed flood in Europe, particularly in Germany in July. And moreover, 2020 proved to be one of the 3 warmest years on record. Climate change is a threat multiplier, such as COVID-19. In order to address uncertainty, the session will highlight bottom-up approach in which system performance is stress tested against climate data and other variables. This session will bring some of the practical case studies from different parts of the world. And we would like to have an interactive discussion session. So I'd like to welcome all the participants to post their question in the chat room so that we can have an interactive session. And with that, I would like to invite John Matthew, Dr. John Matthew, Executive Director of AGWA, Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, to give keynote remark. John.
Thank you so much, Anil, and good day to all of you. I'm John Matthews, the Executive Director for AGWA, the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. And I'd like to give you kind of a quick overview of where we believe, as a group, the organizations that are in this session believe that climate change risk assessment is really headed. If the IPCC told us that lots of bad things are down the road, how do we get ready for them? And we believe that there's a generational change that's occurring. The way that we're going to be structured is I'm going to provide a kind of quick overview of what we think of as the progressive approaches that have developed over the past, say, 10, 12 years. And there will have 3 really good examples of applications of that globally. And then we'll move into a great talk at the end where we really initiate a discussion about where we should be headed. And I'd like to start actually with a headline that I just saw last night as I was preparing for this session, and I was really struck by it. It's straight from California. Many of you may have heard that California is in a very severe drought, one of the worst in its recorded history. And just in the last handful of days, a number of hydropower reservoirs have dropped so far in their storage levels that they can no longer generate electricity. Many of these are not that old. One of them, one of the largest reservoirs in the U.S., Oroville, it's younger than I am in age. And as a result, this is not just water storage for drinking. It's actually a major threat to the California economy. And even worse, arguably the most progressive state in the US on climate change carbon emissions, they have undone 5 years of hard work in terms of carbon emissions by having to bring on 5 natural gas plants to be able to supplement these reservoirs. That's amazing that we're having to have these kinds of trade-offs. And my question is, how did this happen? How did we get in a place where these kinds of issues might be occurring? And if I can summarize my point here for hopefully the whole of the session, it's the idea that predicting is not enough for us, and that bottom-up approaches to how we assess and diagnose risk are really critical to be able to anticipate, things that haven't happened before, that we have no record of, that we actually need to use our imagination for. And top-down and bottom-up approaches, these are kind of insider terms, but I'm going to start with kind of two basic ideas that I believe describe the core elements of that contrast these two approaches to diagnosing risk. One is, where do we start defining the problem and defining risk? And this goes back to the phrase that Anil used right at the beginning, deep uncertainty. Is deep uncertainty this idea that we don't even know what are the alternative futures? We can't choose between them, say which one is more or less likely to be happening. On one side, the traditional approach over the past 20 or 30 years has been to start with predicting, to say, this is what we think one future or maybe a very kind of narrow bandwidth of future is going to look like, versus saying we need to be really open-minded. We need to think very broadly, and we don't know, and we need to think about what we're able to tolerate. And the second, maybe the more traditional part of the meaning of bottom-up approaches, is who defines success and failure for our project. And these two pieces together, we think are the kind of critical elements of these methodologies. Just a very quick slide to show why climate models are often very weak, especially with water intensive projects. If we think about this is actual data from a water utility in the US, and borrowed from a colleague, Patrick Ray, who's actually now at the University of Cincinnati, not University of Massachusetts. If you think about where the climate models have reported data, it's kind of at the low end of variability. If we think about what we might generate with some of the bottom-up approaches, the kinds of data that might be able to be a better range of what to prepare for, it's all those little blue dots, a much broader range. And if we actually see what happened in the case of this one utility, it's the red dot in the middle. The climate models are not good with the water cycle, and they're especially not good if we're trying to build infrastructure, manage infrastructure, to manage the things that we really care about. So top-down water management, traditionally, it started with a decision maker. This is globally, this is the system that we developed over the past few hundred years. That decision maker defines the problem and the need, hands it off to a technical analyst, often an engineer, maybe a planner. Perhaps they do some type of a climate vulnerability assessment. They generate one solution, and then it's handed into the laps of users and stakeholders. Suck it up. We really hope you like it. Maybe you can make some slight adjustments. And we know that this is a very unsatisfying approach. And it's not just climate change that is non-stationary now either. It's also topics like demography and urbanization. Our political systems themselves in the past 5 or 6 years have also been incredibly dynamic, often in very surprising ways. And bottom-up approaches try to reverse this. And it's, again, these two elements about who defines the problem and where we see the risk, how we define the problem itself. We start with a technical analyst acting as a kind of midwife, as a guide, as the lead, the translator of the issues that users and stakeholders are worried about. They try to define the problem and need together. And they develop not just one solution, they develop a whole range of solutions. And then these are confronted against and evaluated by the types of climate risks and their success and failure. And in the end, the decision maker is someone who can choose between these elements and maybe on other criteria, such as cost or political feasibility, and so on. So there are two basic approaches that you're going to hear about in terms of bottom-up approaches. The two kind of well springs for the approach. The first is called decision scaling. It was developed in 2008 by the Great Lakes International Joint Commission, the IJC, in North America between the US and Canada. It was Lake Superior to develop and balance very complex stakeholder environment and to deal with a huge amount of GCM uncertainty. You can see a video on this period at the link. The critical issue here is starting by saying what is success and failure? When does my organization, when do the things I care about break down? When do they stop working? And that is used to develop a set of performance indicators. It defines a risk space very clearly. Then you begin to build the case of evidence. Then you try to test the plausibility, you stress test that and come up with a comprehensive solution for that. And there are a lot of advantages with decision scaling. It answers questions like, how robust is this system overhaul? It tries to combine non-climate and climate factors. It doesn't make assumptions on when impacts are going to occur or try to cherry pick particular GCMs or specific scenarios. And also you can bring in other kinds of data sources. It can be other types of modeling. It can be paleo data and so on. It's a very flexible kind of sandbox approach to risk assessment. The other approach is developed in the Netherlands, and it's called adaptation pathways. You'll hear more about that later as well. And it's the idea that the deep uncertainty challenges us so much that we need to be able to navigate, to think very consciously about the options that we have open to us, so that we might think of various actions. And in the words of the woman most associated with adaptation pathways, Marjolein Haasnoot, we have to think of this as the kind of a metro map, that we're traveling through time, through our decision space. And some options will become more viable or less viable over time, but we won't be able to go on those lines in the metro unless we're conscious of them, unless we're aware of them and tracking them. Perhaps the first full explicit methodology that used bottom-up methodologies was published in 2015 by the World Bank. It emphasizes decision scaling, but it's not limited to it. And it's really evolved since 2015 quite broadly. Many of the partners here have collaborated on something called CRIDA that I'll talk about a little bit more, but you'll hear quite a bit about over the course of this. Deltatus on their website also have a huge amount of information about pathways, including some great overview videos and supplementary tools. The kind of combined approach that I think you're going to be hearing most about in this session, it begins with this idea of a shared vision, taking the technical analyst and the stakeholders, trying to jointly define the performance indicators to evaluate options and ideas, interventions, and try to come up with really two baskets of approaches. Two definitions, in effect, of resilience. One is to think about robust solutions. How comprehensive do we need to be in order for our system not to fail, for the things that we care about not to be hurt? That's the decision scaling component. But there's so much residual uncertainty. That's the big issue with deep uncertainty, that we need to think about keeping our options open, about being flexible. And that's where adaptation pathways is absolutely essential. And combining these two is where we need to be headed. And nature-based solutions actually play a really critical part. We think as a group that they actually fit very well into the kind of flexibility component. They fit very nicely in there. And we have not presented today as much, but in other cases, good examples of using NBS with these methodologies. Thank you very much. I hand it back over to you, Anil.
Thank you, John. Thank you indeed. As John described, defining risk within the context of deep uncertainty and who defines those risks and who defines success and failure. We have been testing and validating the methodology in different places, and we've been organizing webinar since last year, and many practical cases were presented during the webinar we have organized. And in the next, you will hear 3 case studies we have selected based on those presentations made in the UNESCO Agua and ICWAM organized series of webinar from Chile, Zambia, and Thailand. I would like to ask a moderator to put those 3 case studies.
The case study that I will be presenting today for planning under uncertainty is in the Limari Basin in Chile. This basin has a semi-arid climate and also a highly variable natural water supply, but there is an intricate water storage and distribution network called the Sistema Paloma, and also a very active spot water market. And these have allowed agriculture to flourish in the area, making it the main economic activity. However, over the last 30 years, there has been significant fluctuations observed in the volumes of the 3 largest reservoirs in the basin, and volumes have actually dipped to 0% of capacity during the last mega drought from 2010 to 2015. So the goal of our case study, which started in 2018, was to develop appropriate adaptation strategy pathways to ensure future security in the water supply, as well as the livelihoods of the farmers in the basin. To do this, we applied CREDA, or the Climate Risk Informed Decision Analysis Framework. In our case study, we only applied the first 3 steps, so I will present our intermediate results. So at the core of CREDA is the level of concern matrix, which guides the analyst to appropriate actions for their case study. The future risk axis is based on decision scaling results as well as information from stakeholders, while the analytical uncertainty axis is based on the assessment of the uncertainty of the various datasets used in the process. The Limari Basin fell onto quadrant 4, which means a high future risk, but also a high analytical uncertainty. So we are directed by CREDA to develop a combination of robust and flexible actions. Following this guidance, we tested a variety of actions, and we did this by repeating the decision scaling method with the actions implemented into the system. We also did this by decade to get a graph of the temporal variation of the plausibility dimension, and this graph is shown on the slide. The black line represents the no strategy scenario, and each dotted line below represents the scenario under different adaptation actions. The horizontal dotted line on this graph represents the acceptable plausibility that was reported by the stakeholders. Therefore, an acceptable action is one that can sufficiently reduce the plausibility dimension below this dotted line. From the acceptable actions, we developed the adaptation strategy pathways for the Limari Basin, where exceeding the acceptable plausibility acts as a tipping point of an action. In conclusion, following CREDA, we determined that the basin is already at a very critical state, and this limits the portfolio of effective actions while also requiring immediate action. We found that our results were very sensitive to the choice of critical threshold that is used in the decision scaling step, which often may be wrongly chosen. And in the future, we could therefore consider the distance to the critical line instead of the binary critical and non-critical outcome. We could also include more iterations between the steps and vary the threshold definition.
Hello, I am Marta Kosh from the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and I recently partnered with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Institute for Water Resources and the government of Zambia to undertake a case study of bottom-up vulnerability assessment and decision scaling. In this video, I will explain the context, the main issues we encountered, touch on the process, and describe the outcomes. I was a part of a project to rehabilitate the primary water treatment facility for Lusaka, Zambia, a city of over 2 million people. This part of Africa is highly prone to severe drought, and the information available for modeling is thin. The purpose of our study was to improve the facility's operating capacity in drought conditions in an ever drier future. That is, make the plant more robust to a future drier than historical data would suggest. The belief at the time is that a drought would reduce river levels to an extent that production would be restricted. So we began with a conceptual model of the system. The main inputs being energy and water. Then using only Excel, we bootstrapped the little data we had and stressed the system until it failed through Monte Carlo method. We learned that the limiting factor is not water, it is energy. All the energy in the region is hydropower, and low pool levels at the dam supplying power, incidentally, the same reservoir the plant draws its water from, would cause the plant to miss its production goals. We then modeled 3 solutions. They were adding additional storage in the city, creating a dedicated circuit agreement with the power utility, and or providing generator power at the plant when necessary. Our findings were conclusive. Adding generator power was a clear benefit considering cost, timeliness, and reliability. It was the most robust solution. We then were able to recommend that the plant be outfitted at very little cost with hookups for generators directly to the high lift pumps that move treated water to the city. I like this framework because it considers both the severity of the risk, what would happen if we took no action, the quality of the data available, and then produces choices through a process that was understandable to all stakeholders. In this case, the choices allowed us to understand the costs to make the system more robust and thereby reduce impacts on the city. It was quick and low cost. We call this method CREDA, or Climate Risk Informed Decision Analysis. To learn more about CREDA, please see the book by the same name published by UNESCO IC WARM. It explains the step-by-step process of CREDA and includes this case study and other great examples. Thank you.
The case study being presented here focuses on urban resilience to floods and droughts under deep uncertainty. Fueled by increasing economic linkages to China, Lao PDR, and Vietnam, Udon Thani in northeastern Thailand is one of the fastest growing cities in that country. Udon Thani's leadership has big plans for their future as an economic hub and as a gateway to the Mekong region. However, this growth has also led to concerns for both water supply and increased flood impacts. The frequency of both floods and droughts in the region seems to be increasing, and these could be exacerbated by urban growth and climate change. The inability to provide water during the dry season or manage increased flooding at other times would be a threat to the city's strategic vision as both an economic hub and a livable city. As part of a recent USAID program, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers supported the city in building bottom-up resilience to floods and droughts. We began by applying shared vision planning principles to collaboratively develop a feasibility study. Shared vision planning integrates stakeholder collaboration, a formal water resources planning process, and modeling and technical analysis to assist with what can be complex and difficult negotiations among the parties. Udon Thani's Public Works Department, together with the Corps and an urban planner, collaboratively built prototype decision support systems for the city. This enabled stakeholders to quantify the current and future sources of flood and drought stress and to identify possible risk mitigation strategies. This process led the city to prioritize a green infrastructure master plan to address the flooding issues. Udon Thani officials had recognized that the current stormwater system was vulnerable to increased frequency and magnitude of flood events, and that it was just transferring the city's flooding problem to surrounding communities, leading to social conflict. The next step involved using climate risk-informed decision analysis, or CRIDA, to stress test the hydraulic stormwater model of the city to determine the impact of various strategies to lower risk. Using CRIDA, the team examined the incremental costs and benefits of each climate adaptation approach. In this way, CRIDA helped to facilitate a risk-informed decision concerning a socially, politically, and financially acceptable level of insurance against deeply uncertain risks. In conclusion, the green infrastructure approach chosen by the city is providing them with the flexibility to adapt to future conditions while providing immediate recreational benefits, which builds community support. The city has already begun design and construction of a first phase of the approved master plan.
Thank you very much. As you have seen from these three flash presentations, we have presented implementation of CRIDA, Climate Risk Informed Decision Analysis, the methodology that published by UNESCO and ICWAM back in 2018. And we've been supporting different organizations to undertake case studies. I would like to encourage participants to come up forward and pose the question based on the presentation, but I would also like to ask my colleague to put the link of those webinar where those cases which were just presented in a flash video, you will have a detailed presentation. So Rita, would you be able to put the link of that webinar? We organized 7 webinar series, adaptation in an age of uncertainty, tools for climate resilient water management approaches, so that audience can look at those link later on. But please come forward and ask the question so that we can have an interactive session after this talk. And now I would like to invite Ms. Sadie McInvoy from Deltares. She's a water resources and adaptation expert. She will talk about the next generation, improving bottom-up approaches for accessibility and scalability by scalability. Sadie, over to you.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So as Anil said, my name is Sadie McAvoy. I work with Deltares, and I thought it would be interesting to present what we're calling the next generation, or the avenues of development for bottom-up approaches. And what I'll present today involves my own work, but also those of my colleagues, Adioka and Umit Tanner, who are also working on this topic. There we go. So I wanted to start with a few gaps and lessons that we've learned so far from our applications, like those that were presented in the flash talks. And some of this John had already hinted at in the presentation earlier. So one of the first things that we kind of bump up against repeatedly is that the complexity of the analyses and the results sometimes can be difficult to communicate to certain stakeholders and decision makers. So we need to find better ways to kind of work on that communication. Similarly, the intensity of computational data and resource needs can be high, and this can be a barrier to application in all different contexts, not only Latin America and Africa and Asia that were presented, but we also see these barriers in Europe and North America. And then one of the things that we also want to work on is, or that we kind of find as a lesson, is that we need to better connect with more traditional risk-based approaches in IWRM, because now these are presented or maybe considered by some as very oppositional or different, but we can really complement and work off of those more traditional approaches. We also find that there's a need for better integration of qualitative information, and that includes expert judgment in our quantitative results. As I mentioned, the analyses are quite quantitative and quite complex, and so these more qualitative components and expert judgments are sometimes put to the side, or they're not well incorporated. Another gap that we are facing is how we evaluate. So this is both in terms of making the performance metrics and thresholds that John explained up front, making those more representative, but also making our economic evaluations incorporate equity. And then another area that we're finding increasingly, and this includes a project that we're working on right now in Zimbabwe, is that we need to also start looking at these kind of analyses for sectors beyond water. And this can be for just other climate sensitive sectors, but it can also just be compounded with water projects. So for instance, drought and fires that we're dealing with in Zimbabwe right now. So we've defined 3 avenues of development that are really the center of our focus in the near future. And the first one is to lower barriers of application. The second one is to broaden and enrich performance metrics and evaluations. And the third one is to increase decision relevance of the analyses and their results. And so I'm just going to go through these and kind of explain what we're doing on each of these and give some examples. So the first avenue of development, lowering barriers to application, we have three main kind of topics. The first one is to find ways to integrate and use qualitative and quantitative light levels of analysis. This should help us be able to apply this in more cases that maybe don't have the resources, either time, money, data, for example, to do full assessments. The other thing that we're working on is developing open source tools that can link bottom-up methods to rapidly deployable models. So for example, hydrologic or environmental models, and that link to global and local data platforms. So I'll give an example of a tool that we've been developing for that. And then another thing that we've been focusing on is really capacity building. So providing trainings that Anil already mentioned, that we've been doing webinars, but I'll show some other ways that we've been working to build capacity in this area. So here's a tool that I mentioned already that we've been working on at Deltaris and starting to use. This is an open online toolbox, and the idea is to make climate risk assessments available to more users and to kind of lower the barriers on technical and specialized skills. The idea is that the tool is kind of a single-click design that allows climate stress tests to be performed in almost all locations, because it relies on global climate data sets and also these existing or rapidly deployable hydrological models. And then the last part of the tool is that it can combine the simulation results with defined performance metrics and those risk thresholds that John introduced, that are kind of key to these bottom-up assessment approaches. And then also just to share a little bit about the training and capacity building we've been working on. This comes in a lot of different entry points. So we have had some in-person group trainings. We also last year pivoted to a massive open online course that was hosted by UNESCO on the CRIDA methodology. And as have already been mentioned, these webinar series. So we're really trying to come at practitioners and maybe interested professionals and decision makers in different ways, and build up that capacity. And then of course, also through partnering on projects with local cases. So the second avenue of development that we're working on has been broadening and enriching performance metrics and evaluations. One of these topics has been how we can develop better indicators to allow us to kind of evaluate systems performance on social and environmental values, and for those to really be representative. Another topic that we're working on is the economic evaluation. So how to introduce equity and social inclusiveness in those economic evaluations that we make of different measures and of adaptation pathways. And then finally, we're also working on integrating qualitative information in those evaluations. And I have just a really simple example. Actually, this is also the Limari Basin, which was presented in one of the flash talks. In the CRIDA process for Limari, for example, we evaluated the costs and damages and of course benefits, but this didn't give us any insight into the distribution of those costs or benefits. And it also didn't give us insight into knock-on effects or cascading effects. So that's something that we really need to improve. And then additionally, when we talk about the kind of scope of analysis, there's room for improvement there. We focused on irrigated agriculture because of the models and the information we were using, but that didn't include pretty substantial number of small scale farmers who rely directly on groundwater boreholes. So there are a lot of ways that we need to kind of improve these assessments. So finally, the third area of development is improving decision relevance. Here we're focusing on local ownership. That's largely through partnering and letting local case studies lead these projects. We're also providing stakeholder engagement guidance because, as John outlined, stakeholders really play a central role in defining our analysis. It's not just about getting their buy-in and support. So the way to engage them in the analysis and in defining performance metrics and thresholds, that really needs to be improved and made clear to for applications all over the world. And so we're working on that now. And then finally, new tools to support better visualization and communication of results. So this is just an example of the stakeholder guidance document that we're working on now and will be published shortly. It also includes tools for structuring and supporting stakeholder engagement. And then we also, at Deltaris, we've been working with the World Bank as well on developing a new tool for, that's part of this open online tool that I showed earlier. It will have a module for visualizing results. That part hasn't been finalized yet, but this is how like traditionally our results look, and we're looking at ways to make that more useful to different kinds of stakeholders and decision makers. So those are the three areas of development I just wanted to introduce today, and I hope people will share maybe areas that they think we could also focus on, or issues that they're having, or maybe developments they're working on as well. Thanks. That's back to you, Anil.
Thank you, Sadie. Thank you for providing next steps on the bottom-up approaches. Indeed, as you mentioned, we've been facilitating to undertake case studies in different parts of the world, in thematic issues, in arid land, in hydropower, in water supply system, but also urban water, green infrastructure. So now we will go into much more details with your interactive question and answer. And there is also opportunity. I would like to highlight that we've been facilitating lots of training program, but also open online courses. So please come forward. The link has been provided, and I would like to hand over for the interactive session to my colleague Rita Martillera and Sadie McEnroy for having interaction with you. Over to you.
Thank you, Anil. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you here today. So as presented in this session, we believe that bottom-up solutions to address complex problems such as climate change adaptation can play a significant role. So we would like to hear from the audience and about their experiences, their thoughts on case studies and changes and improvements that they might suggest to future bottom-up approaches. So I will be reading some of the questions that we got from the audience during the presentations. There is one question from Sarah Logreen for all the speakers, and she asks, I can imagine that a challenge for bottom-up approaches that rely on stakeholder engagement is that inequalities based on gender, race, socioeconomical class, caste, etc., can lead to barriers or exclusion of certain groups. Have you experienced this, and how do you navigate it? So I would ask maybe John Matthews to start with this. John?
Sure, thanks. I appreciate that, Rita. It's a really important question, and I think actually it's a really timely one too, because the topic of climate justice has actually been coming up quite a bit in policy issues. I can tell you, Sarah, that when this is something that as a technical person that we actually really struggle with and try to work really hard at that stakeholder engagement process to make sure that we try to include people. One of the most comprehensive processes I've seen was led by the World Bank in Mexico City. Over the past few years, they convened something like 37, 39 different organizations from across Mexico City, which was facing a really extreme ongoing a water scarcity. Something like 1,500, 2,000 people were involved in these stakeholder engagement processes. And one of in asking all of these individuals and organizations, one of the issues that came out very clearly to the World Bank at that point was that water scarcity was really a poverty issue, and that was the main effect that they needed to address. And so they were able to use at a massive spatial scale bottom-up approaches as a way to coordinate and develop a coherent strategy to treat climate change as a climate justice issue, as a poverty issue across the greater Mexico City region. And I'll also say, Del Taurus and Agua and UNESCO and a handful of others are also working in a string of projects down East Africa into Southern Africa. And we've been working in particular in Eastern Zimbabwe. And one of the things in our stakeholder engagement there at very local communities, we've tried very hard, often trying to actually really strongly supplement our work to make sure that even we're trying to talk to people who don't show up at the meetings. That's often women and girls. It's often maybe some of the more excluded members of the community. The people who don't necessarily have power. So that's something that Sadie has actually been really passionate and engaged on.
Yeah, I just wanted to share that we actually have had quite a lot of experience with this issue. And for example, I think that one of the opportunities for these bottom-up approaches in terms of being socially inclusive is that different groups actually help define the critical thresholds, not only the key performance metrics, but also the critical thresholds. And those critical thresholds can be different. For example, if you're talking about water scarcity, the way that the level at which we reach a critical threshold or failure can be very different for example, a large industry and small-scale farmers in a region. And so there is, of course, also the element of stakeholder engagement that's around, social learning and collaboration, but we can actually approach different groups separately. We've done this, for example, in Ecuador, where local residents did not feel comfortable sharing their experiences and their opinions in front of municipality. And we actually separate those. We've even done door-to-door surveys to kind of understand what are those acceptability thresholds, what are the performance thresholds. And so the question is really whether you have the time and money to do that really well in the way, for example, we've tried to do it in Ecuador. And as John said, we're working on that quite a bit now in Zimbabwe and South Africa. And so that's one of the reasons that we're focused on those indicators, the social, inclusive, and economic and ecosystem indicators, and also how we evaluate and prepare these more standardized stakeholder engagement so that that's done really well in a socially inclusive way. So it's definitely on our radar.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Sadie. I see that we have a second question from the audience from Simon Tuo, and he asks, what's the opportunity and role of integrated spatial planning to determine livelihood zones in order to safeguard population from floods and drought impacts while optimizing the use of water resources? Reliable quantities, example for agriculture, to reduce the overdependence on variable supply and excessive abstraction. I see that we have Will Logan here today, the director of ICWARM, Associated Center of UNESCO. Will, are you around to answer this question?
I can give it a shot. I think it depends on if the spatial planning is referring to existing GIS layers or whether it's the project itself. But yes, absolutely. That's a huge help in order to for the modeling, for example. If you're going to be combining the bottom-up planning, the shared vision planning, collaborative planning, with truly understanding the background of the people there. So yes, absolutely, wonderful tool.
Thank you, Will. I think we still have a few minutes before closing. There were some questions being shared today, and I would like maybe to ask the speakers to provide their insights on what we were asking on the poll. So based on their experience, what could be the biggest barriers towards the implementation of bottom-up approaches as in their daily work, as they have seen it? Could it be the lack of data, the lack of analytical solutions, the lack of funding, any other options that that someone might want to comment? Sadie, perhaps?
Sorry, you want me to comment on the poll or on?
On the question, on the poll, because I think we have very few results on the poll.
Okay, yeah, I mean, personally, in my experience, the biggest kind of barrier is usually time and money, and those things kind of go together. With enough of those, we can overcome a lot of other issues like data scarcity or kind of creative ways of performing analyses. But especially kind of, you know, based on the first question that we received about inclusivity, I mean, these things really take time to do those well, and similar to building models, like the example that I gave of where we weren't really exemplary in our representation in modeling irrigated agriculture only, and that was really due to very limited time. So I think yeah, that for me, that's the biggest barrier. I think, of course, the capacity building, so that we can really build these communities of practice around the world. That's one of the reasons that we're focusing on this cluster of case studies in Southern Africa right now, is not so that it's just one group or a handful of analysts who have carried out these projects, but there's actually a community of practice, people who have gone through the stakeholder engagement phase maybe, or who've done the modeling, for example, and so that they can help each other, rely on each other, and carry out these projects for themselves. And this first phase, we're really helping in kind of working together and building that capacity. So those would be the two things I find in my work, at least, are the most limiting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Sadie, for your answer. I think we are approaching the end of our time here for this interactive session. However, how Anil has mentioned in the chat here on Pathable, you can find the link to the webinar series that we promoted here on UNESCO, with a lot of examples of the applications of bottom-up approaches with case studies from all over the world. And now to close our session, I would hand over to you, Anil. You are muted, Anil.
Yes, thank you, Rita. Thank you very much for this interactive session. Before I make a concluding remark, I see there is a lot of interest on climate justice. Maybe John can elaborate a little bit more, because I see there is lots of in the chat room. I see lots of interest. Maybe John, can you come back on climate justice? It's relevant to peri-urban area. It's also, there is some of other issues. Can you quickly come back to that so that we can also satisfy some of those questions?
Sure, there are some fantastic comments and questions. The comment from Myanmar and from my friend and colleague Simon Thuo, too, I think, are also looking at this topic. And I want to say that, you know, most of the people I suspect that are here, at least on the speaking side, most of us are technical people. We have a kind of technical, often analytical orientation, maybe scientists or engineers, planners. And if I can go back to Simon's question, I think he's asking, how do we make sure that our quantitative approaches are actually, that they are touching on issues like climate justice? And I think the stakeholder engagement is actually really essential to that. I also note that I have a friend that's among the attendees who's a lawyer, and the stakeholder engagement process is really the marriage of quantitative approaches in governance. And that's it's a kind of collective decision making. So we may be talking about a quantitative analysis may show that there are serious flood risks that are in a place, that maybe poor people or highly vulnerable populations are being affected. But in the past, with a top-down approach, we would just come up with a solution and we would impose it on them. I think that what we're trying to say here now is, actually, we need to go and talk to those folks. One of the really nice case studies that's come out of Del Taras with some partners in Ecuador has been looking at exactly the issue of flooding in an urban setting. And the people there said, actually, there's some kinds of floods that we can live with and we're okay. There actually are, the performance indicators that they set would be different maybe than the ones that we as analysts might set. And it's that conversation, I think, that it's actually, I would say that like a kind of self-defined approach to climate justice that's really critical in this. And it's simply asking people, what is important to you, and how do we bring that into our quantitative and technical work?
Thank you, John, very much. One of the things that I would like to add also, in this CRIDA process, which John presented in his first slide, begin with the shared vision planning workshop, and that I would like to relate with the citizen science. We've been promoting citizen science, and the next coming phase of IHP, Science for a Water Secure World in a Changing Environment, which is just endorsed by member states, we will be doing lots of citizen science, so engaging non-scientific community in data collection processes and validation processes. So with that, I would like to thank all the audience and panelists for their excellent remark, and I would like to invite you to visit our website, which provide the webinar series Adaptation in an Age of Uncertainty Tools for Climate Resilient Water Management Approaches. And gathering all these case studies, which we are going to continue to do so with the partners, ICWAM, AGWA, and Del Taras, we are going to publish case studies. And we're going to also launch a policy brief, Planning Water Resilient from Bottom Up to Meet Climate and Development Goals, which will be launched during the global conference, which I would like to invite all of you to participate virtually, which will be held here in UNESCO headquarters in Paris as a pre-COP event, 26 to 28 of October, Global Conference on Climate Resilient Water Management Approaches, Application towards Climate Action and 2030 Development Agenda, in which we will have not only the case studies that has been presented, undertaken in different parts of the world, but also technical session and science policy session. And as an outcome of that conference, we would like to bring the message to COP26, where with AGWA and others, we are going to have a side event so that the contribution, really policy advice will be providing to member states so that they can really take that message for their NDCs. So with that, I would like to thank all the panelists and speakers for their excellent intervention. The co-organizer partner, ICWAM, AGWA, and Deltares, we will be organizing events, but also as highlighted by Sadi and John, we will continue to organize capacity building events in different regions. And I would like to thank my colleague Eunice from UNESCO, Rita, who has been working with Alex from AGWA to prepare this session here in World Water Week. I would like to thank for the contribution and thank you all. And please visit our website. There will be some other linkages posted at AGWA's website, also in UNESCO's website, and provide us your feedback. Thank you very much.